A new Harvard University poll spells more trouble for President Joe Biden and his chances of getting reelected in the general election. Now, what this poll did was look at the favorability for Donald Trump, for Joe Biden, along with other candidates, Nikki Haley, RFK Jr. They were involved in this poll as well. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're gonna focus on Trump versus Biden, since that is very likely going to be the outcome of the general election. So they found that in addition to boasting a 6-point lead over President Joe Biden, 48% to 42%, Trump's favorability rating has recovered to the point where he is now seen positively by a plurality of the country. So this is the first time a poll has shown this result for Trump. And we have been noticing that polls have shown Trump increase his lead against Joe Biden in the swing states. And that's where the numbers really matter. Now we're seeing some movement when it comes to the favorability of both candidates. While 36% of the 2022 respondents indicated that they view Trump very unfavorably, and an additional 11% view him at least somewhat unfavorably. 30% say they view him very favorably, and an additional 20% view him at least somewhat favorably. So at least 50% of the respondents have a somewhat favorable view to very favorable view of Donald Trump. When you look at Biden, the numbers aren't as high, let's put it that way. So by contrast, Biden is not as favorable among the electorate, according to this Harvard University poll. Let's take a look at the numbers. 39% view the incumbent very favorably, and 15% more at least view him somewhat unfavorably. So Biden's favorable numbers summed, meanwhile, add up to only 43%, whereas for Trump, it added up to 50%. That means that while Trump's head is above water for what seems like the first time in ages, Biden is underwater by 11. And Biden also, remember, desperately needs to win the swing states in order to win the general election. But if you go back to 2020, when the majority of the American electorate was really dissatisfied with Trump's handling of COVID, and they were more willing to support Biden just to get Trump out. That situation is really not at play in this general election. So for instance, if you go back to 2020, Biden did win a lot of these swing states, but by a very narrow margin.
We might have millions of people watching this show, but you can be the difference maker, because we just need 1% of our audience to be paid members, and then this show can be around forever. So you can make that difference. Click join now.
So that year, Biden triumphed over Trump by 0.23% in Georgia, 1.17% in Pennsylvania, 0.30% in Arizona, and 0.63% in Wisconsin. Polls conducted in those states for the current election cycle have shown Trump leading in all of them. And that's not just based on 1 or 2 polls. There have now been several polls that have shown similar results. The first one being that New York Times Siena College poll. Similar results were then shown in subsequent polls. And so again, things aren't looking good for Biden when it comes to the polls. And if there was one outlier that made that clear, whereas all the other polls showed that it's gonna be a tight race and Biden's actually doing okay, that would be one thing. But now we're seeing a consistent flow of polls come out showing that Biden is really struggling in these swing states. And remember, nationally, Biden would have to win by 5 percentage points in order to clinch the 2024 general election. Now things are looking so wobbly for Biden that now donors are concerned, and donors have been speaking to the press about Biden's performance during some of these public engagements. And so Axios recently published a piece titled "Biden's Cheat Sheet at Fundraisers Worry Donors." And according to that piece, Biden's fundraisers go as follows. He delivers opening remarks, typically on a teleprompter. And look, we've had former presidents deliver remarks on teleprompters all the time. That's not really a big problem. But reporters are then ushered out of the venue as soon as he's done with his remarks. And if the reporters are lucky, a select few of them will be able to ask some questions. And so Biden takes about 2 to 3 questions that have already been vetted by his staff, and he uses flashcards for the answers to those vetted questions. So that apparently has left some of these donors concerned. He leaves after he answers a few of those vetted questions. And Biden advisors say that the president is given those note cards only for very detailed and technical questions, and say that he frequently does spontaneous Q&As. I think that that is overstating what's really happening here. I don't think Biden frequently does spontaneous Q&As. In fact, if you compare his media engagements to previous presidents, you'll notice that his number is far lower. Now, the staged Q&A sessions have left some donors wondering whether Biden can withstand the rigors of a presidential campaign, let alone potential debates with former President Trump, who's 77 years old. Now, how did the Biden campaign respond to this story overall? Well, they pivoted to what has worked out pretty well for the Democratic Party in the midterm elections, the issue of reproductive rights. And to be honest, I think that it makes sense in this context, given the fact that we just got some pretty terrible news out of Alabama with its Supreme Court essentially treating a fertilized egg, an embryo, if you will, as a living, breathing child. And that has had some ramifications in the state of Alabama, including the stopping of in vitro fertilization in the state, because if a fertilized egg, if an embryo is considered the same as a human life, well then the doctors and the clinics that provide this service could open themselves up to potential prosecution. And so there are already people suffering the consequences of that. And as a result, the Biden administration immediately pivoted to that, or Biden campaign, I should say, pivoted to that in answering why they think that Biden is going to have a better chance than Trump in winning the general election. So Kevin Munoz, who is a Biden campaign spokesperson, said, in news that matters to the American people when it comes to the 2024 election today, 3 IVF clinics in Alabama ceased operations out of fear of criminal prosecution by the state, all at the feet of Donald Trump. And I don't know how effective that messaging is going to be at the moment, especially because there are other issues that core Democratic demos are unhappy with. If you look at some of the town halls that are taking place in places like Chicago, for instance, you have key demographics, black voters, for instance, incredibly frustrated over the migrant issue. So I'm wondering which one of those issues is going to carry more weight with typical Democratic voters. But nonetheless, I want to give you a little more from what the Biden campaign is saying here. Biden has some of his most notable unscripted moments at late night events with donors. On Wednesday, during a 3-day West Coast swing, he called Russian President Vladimir Putin a crazy SOB. In June, he referred to Chinese President Xi Jinping as a dictator at a California fundraiser. And so apparently this is the kind of stuff that Biden is being lauded for in the liberal leaning press and by his own campaign. These are the kinds of things that they bring up in an effort to kind of prop him up as someone who's still a very strong candidate against Donald Trump. It's just that it's not really registering in the polling. Things could change. I want to remain somewhat hopeful, but at this point in the election, it's a fantasy to think that Biden's going to drop out. He's not going to drop out. He's going to keep going. The real question is, once all is said and done, and once we're at the Democratic convention, will the Democratic Party have a plan in place to, if Biden chooses to, drop out and hand over delegates to someone that he endorses? I have no idea. But if things continue the way that we're seeing them go, the trajectory that we're seeing for Biden and the Democratic Party, things aren't really looking good for the general election. Now, there's still a lot of time left. Things can change. We should stay open-minded. But Trump seems to be increasing his support, whereas Biden appears to be flailing. And if you are genuinely concerned about Trump and the threat he poses to our democratic process, if you genuinely think he's going to dismantle our democracy, well, you would want the strongest possible Democratic candidate to run against him. It just appears that at this moment, that's not the case.